Welcome back, everyone, to another Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most monumental cultural shifts of the 20th century. We're looking at modern drama in the English language, and specifically how the stage went from polite, predictable, easy entertainment into a raw and incredibly powerful mirror of human anxiety after World War II. So I want you to think about this question for a second. How exactly does a world recover, and more importantly, express itself after the absolute devastation of a global war? Because the reality is, World War II completely shattered those traditional pre-war happy shows. The polite parlor dramas and upbeat musical comedies of the 1930s, they simply couldn't hold up a mirror to a society that had just witnessed unimaginable destruction. And that left a massive, desperate vacuum in the theater world. To make sense of this massive shift, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at post-war trauma on stage, then dive into Beckett, Pinter, and the absurd. From there, it's over to Arthur Miller moving from confidence to doubt, followed by John Osborne and political drama, before wrapping it all up with a summary of modern drama.
All right, let's jump right into part one, post-war trauma on stage.
When the war finally ended, the cultural links to pre-war playwrights were basically completely severed. The world was dealing with this profound, heavy sense of existential dread, and the theater desperately needed a completely new language to express it. An empty stage like the one we're looking at perfectly captures how broken the world felt. Those traditional forms of entertainment, the well-made plays with neat little moral conclusions, they just couldn't reflect this new, traumatized reality. Playwrights were literally staring at an empty space, realizing they had to invent a completely new way to communicate the human experience.
And what's really wild is how incredibly fast this revolution took hold. Within just a few short years, we get this rapid-fire succession of absolute game changers. In 1949, Arthur Miller drops Death of a Salesman in America. Just 4 years later, in 1953, Samuel Beckett debuts Waiting for Godot in Paris. And then by 1956, John Osborne hits London with Look Back in Anger. So literally in less than a decade, the entire paradigm of what a play could actually be was rewritten on a global scale.
Which brings us to our second section, Beckett and Pinter, and the theater of the absurd. So this post-war trauma, it quickly morphed into silence, absurdity, and downright menace on the stage. In Beckett's original notes, you can actually see a handwritten instruction right at the bottom of the page, pause, crucial. With Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett completely redefined theater by making the silence, the actual space between the words, just as important as the spoken words themselves. His characters, Vladimir and Estragon, wait endlessly for someone who literally never arrives. Beckett used this extreme economy of language to highlight the absolute failure of communication. In a world that no longer made sense, his characters speak in these cyclical, repetitive patterns that just underscore their total purposelessness. Now, while Beckett was busy working with existential voids, Harold Pinter took a slightly different route, creating what we now call comedies of menace. Think of Pinter's early plays like The Birthday Party or The Caretaker. He used everyday objects and these super confined claustrophobic rooms to create an atmosphere of intense, unexplained intimidation. In a Pinter play, the menace doesn't come from some grand philosophical statement. It comes from the terrifying, unspoken tensions of just ordinary, everyday life. So the crucial takeaway here is this stark contrast between the two. Beckett essentially strips everything away to an existential void. He gives us a bare stage and a single tree to represent the loss of all societal certainties. Pinter, on the other hand, grounds his absurdity in terrifyingly recognizable social realities. For Pinter's characters, language isn't just failing, language is actively being used as a weapon to claim territory in a tiny claustrophobic room.
Moving right along to section 3, Miller and the shift from confidence to doubt.
Let's jump across the Atlantic and see how this movement was playing out there. While the British stage was wrestling with existentialism and class, American theater, largely through the sheer genius of Arthur Miller, was systematically dismantling its own national mythology. Miller really articulated a massive turning point in national consciousness. We're talking about a move from boundless confidence to profound, deep-seated doubt in the American dream itself. He completely transitioned American theater by focusing on the unsuccessful in the supposed land of success. He took the grand tragedy that was usually reserved for kings and queens, and he applied it to the psychological collapse of the ordinary middle-class citizen. And this is a huge deal because it forced audiences to finally confront the hidden anxieties lurking right behind post-war prosperity.
In Death of a Salesman, Miller doesn't just talk about economic anxiety in the abstract, he literally puts it right on the stage. Willy Loman's breaking down car and his failing refrigerator act as direct physical symbols of a failing, unattainable American dream. The shiny, modern conveniences that capitalism promised are literally falling apart in real time, right alongside Willy's own crumbling psychological delusions. He had the wrong dreams. All wrong. That incredibly powerful quote from Willy's son, Biff, perfectly encapsulates the shattered illusions of the post-war American citizen. Miller was showing his audience that the capitalistic myth of being well-liked and endlessly successful wasn't just some harmless fantasy. It was actually a highly destructive force that could absolutely tear a family apart. All right, back over to the UK for Section 4, Osborne and political drama. So, heading back to Britain, we see how the existential waiting of the early 50s eventually evolved into passionate working-class fury. In 1956, John Osborne fundamentally changed the game with Look Back in Anger. He introduced the world to the angry young man archetype through his protagonist, Jimmy Porter. Now, Jimmy was a working-class, highly educated young guy who felt entirely alienated by a society that offered him absolutely no place to belong. This single character completely broke the mold of those polite, middle-class heroes we talked about earlier, and ushered in a thrilling, brand-new era of raw, confrontational energy on the stage. And this is where we see a really fascinating transatlantic difference of the era. Osborne's characters lash out at society with explicit political anger and raw outward energy. It's working-class fury aimed straight at tearing down the establishment. Meanwhile, Miller's characters in America turn that destruction inward. It's a domestic, middle-class, psychological collapse caused by the failure of capitalistic promises. Both playwrights have characters rebelling against their societies, for sure, but the direction of their dramatic energy is entirely different. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, a summary of modern drama. We've covered some incredible ground today, so let's synthesize these complex movements. If you want the ultimate takeaway, the blueprint of modern drama in the English language really rests on a few key pillars. Thanks to Beckett, we got a radical evolution of language where silence became just as loud as speech. Thanks to Osborne, traditional class boundaries on stage were totally shattered, which paved the way for explicit political and social messaging. Through Miller, the myth of the American dream was permanently deconstructed. And ultimately, all of these playwrights transformed the theater from a place of mere entertainment into a vital, urgent tool used to illuminate modern human anxieties. So I'm going to leave you with this one final provocative thought. If the sheer trauma of the mid-20th century shattered the traditional stage to create the brilliance of modern drama, what current global shifts, the technology we use every day, the massive societal changes we're living through right now, what will define the theater of tomorrow? Human expression is always adapting, it's always evolving. Keep exploring, keep watching, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.